Hello and most welcome to 946 of the Heidegger series. We're having today a most beautiful day and some odd clouds, I can say. Maybe one of the oddest clouds I ever seen. We try to make a panoramic view later here so you can have a gander yourselves. We'll dwell more into the fantastic book by Susie Vrobel, and I will also try to get her first book. I think it could help to further the understanding of the later book. That first book was about simultaneity, and I think it preceded her current book by 5-6 years, something like that. It'd be interesting to contact her as well. She seemed to be one of those important persons that turned up later, and I also understand now it was absolutely necessary to have the earlier walk through Heidegger, Derrida, Rodolphe Gasquet and so forth. And I am quite certain that Susie Vrobel will sort of shed even more light into Heidegger and Derrida and Rodolphe Gasquet. This is a most interesting take, and she's sort of gathering all the information in the field and then add some more. Fractality is without the true nature of space. And I'm training every day to get more fractal. And something you will notice in the beginning, you will think about still a three-dimensional space that you move about in, but things turning a little bit fractal slowly. But that surrounding space, that needs to be fractal as well. And Susie Vrobel suggests that will take at least 2 to 3 months until you achieve that. But do remember, this is not something that comes about by itself. It's not enough to read the book. You do actually need to train this on a regular basis, daily basis, I would say. Otherwise, fractality will not come. The subject is in on it, and I would say the last 3 books are very much doing books. We are too used to have this passive understanding where you don't do anything and you just ask question, either to the book or to yourself, and you think that would be enough. It is not enough, not at all, very far from. It's work, and it's something that you actually do, even though that might be what you previously termed to be purely mental. In fractality, there is not such a thing as purely mental. That doesn't even mean anything when we look closer to it. Mental is more of a group term that is very clumsy and too crude and too cut by a really big knife to suit the purpose. It's unsharp, it's not complex enough. So it's definitely not so much that it would be wrong. Rather, it's the level of complexity that is problematic. There are no absolute wrongs as such in fractality. It's more of a level-like opening up way of things to be. Rather than just have a stark yes or no question or boxes to tick as the school system do these days, giving the impression that knowledge is a yes or no, or that there is something like absolute understanding, and then the truth somehow is out there and we don't have to do anything by ourselves. That is absolute non-true. We as observer, we are in on it, to every bit, to every little piece of our system, and we need to intentionally sort of train that. Or say training is much more important to have a physical training. If you don't train your fractality, fractality is going to haunt you, and you will be sort of not getting anyway. But whereas you enter fractality, you will enter the domain of youth once more, the childlike observance, plus you will have all the tools of an adult, and they would be much sharper than they are in metaphysics of presence, so to speak. Well, enough about that. Let's cut to the chase and get into the lecture. The lesson from Henri Bergson and Edmund Husserl is an important one, and that is that time does not come by itself. It is a constant thrust from the person and the environment. That is the endogenous plus the exogenous. And this is what makes projection, the so-called futuring, the active term, not as a noun, not like an ontic take on what time is. That time is something that sort of can be defined in what it is not or what it is. That is existence and non-existence. That's the ontic question, where we can only ask what. This is a why question, and the why question opens up much more. It asks about direction, it asks about intention. Why should I do that? Why should I form that? Now we come into the very existence. Existence cannot be without a why question. And this thrust, this projection of yourself and the environment, that is what makes retention also. And retention, the active process of going into the past, pasting as a noun, that's an absolute sine qua non for entering projection. And once you have those two both going, where you make absolute complex fractal structures before you go into the past or the future, you will have a chance of having a fractal interaction. So this is maybe the cutting edge where it becomes rather different from the old model, where you just perceive and you just get future and you just have past. It is very different, the ontic towards compared to the ontological. This is a much more moving thing. And this is interesting. Susie Vrobel uses a lot what we discussed before from David Bradel et al. That sensing is something outward. And even to me, as I mentioned day before yesterday, it was a surprise to know that hearing needs a tone in the ear. Everybody has this tone, but to a varying degree, depending how active your hearing is. And that's a training thing. Nothing that's given free. And if you live in the metaphysics of presence, you have not trained it. Therefore, it's very dull. And therefore, it also helps to give the idea of a stable, static world out there. Susie Vrobel shows how the fractality of the ear signal goes outwards and do the interaction with the exogenous. The endogenous tone goes to the exogenous. The same with vision. It used to be the case that vision, if it was perceived or illustrated, was a ray coming out of the eyes. And this is also how it was described before the pre-Socratic in ancient Greece. That's an active thing that did not come from the outside, but started at the inside. This is projection of senses. Without you projecting what you want to see, your intention or what you want to experience, there will be no reality. Because to read off a fractality, you need a complex fractality. And it doesn't get more complex than you construct it to be. So you see, the observer all of a sudden becomes much more important. And this is such a nice way also explain quantum mechanics, but nothing about this today. All old models, which we are part and parcel of, misses the point completely. And this was actually the fact within neurology until a couple of years ago. The idea of representationalism and the idea that the time was something completely external survived into the 2000s. I would say it didn't die properly until 2010, 2011, 2012. And then it was a massive work to start anew. And of course that work is not finished. It has to sort of combat or make equal with a tradition that has 2,500 years on its shoulder. This idea of an externality, the stark externality to the world, has affected how we actually perceive world and how we work. This is why I say fractality won't come for free. You need to change your body, and it's a bodily change. If you don't change your body, there is no chance you will understand fractality. It is something you do, because we live now in an idiosyncratic Western passivity. We are all, so to say, passive victims, but we choose in that passivity. It has become part and parcel of our bodily makeup. The slouch is an acceptance that the thing comes to you. Otherwise you wouldn't slouch. You would realize you can get so much more by being directed outwards and taking everything in, and actively project to the outside world what you want. That is extremely important. Without you sending artificial constructs, if you like, just to tease Rousseau and his naturalness. Without you sending out constructed things to the world, there will be no meeting of the two fractalities. But once the meeting of the fractalities are in action, you will sense a greater energy. You will sense that the world comes to life again. And the difference is incredible. I felt it the last couple of days many times here. It's like the colors become more vivid. All of a sudden reality sort of have dimensions to it. Proper dimensions, not these XYZ, but fractal dimensions of reality. And those can only be achieved by being active, actively sending something out, a construct, something artificial. All those despised terms of the metaphysics of presence I am now currently using in order to make a turn. I will probably leave them, but they are similar to the arc writing or arcade writing of Derrida, a specific instrument to turn the tables. Once the tables are turned, we can leave the instrument to the side and go into the very meat of it. In Eastern culture, we have prana and ki. I mentioned that before. And you can call prana or ki the energy or the intention you have in projecting outwards. Your capacity to project, to construct a world all by yourself. The level of ability to do that, that is prana. And it is something in all Eastern cultures where it's called prana, chi, ki, ji, or te. It is something you learn. All Easterners learn that since youth. It's an integral part of their culture. And I think it's in all culture until you adopt a static model. We did 2,500 years ago. And with this almost physical thrust, I think especially in the beginning, it feels very physical to do future. That you really put your effort to see what is going to happen next. In the beginning, those images will be very dim. You are not used to projecting. So it is like you can't see the future. Instead, you use the stalemate episodes of what happened before. And you use those as like Lego klossar or building blocks from Lego to put the future together, make choices and so forth. Projection is quite different. It's an active process of constructing the future. It comes from you and what you want of the future. Intention, all of a sudden, becomes the building material of the world. Go into the playfield and engage. Engage actively by seeing things in front of you, things that you want, not taken from the past, but from your intelligence. It's the complexity of your imagery, of your futuring, your projection, retention, that makes it more and more possible to sort of meet the exogenous. This metaphysical present, simplified model don't have much capacity. It has some, so you will still get some reality, but you can get more. It's a meeting of difference. And it's a awakening of a part of your sensing system, the soul. I was awakening of the soul. Active projection is your spiritual path, one could say also. It's not only about crude material or mental world, it's also spiritual path. And that can only be taken once you really project intensely. After long time of training, as your mental spiritual soul will project clearer and clearer, more and more complex projections. Retention is the same. It is not passively looking into what has happened, like moments gather up like a bead and they get stored in the computer memory, and even the function that takes them out, the memories, called executive function in later terminology, well, not so late, it's just 10 years ago, it's absolutely passive. So in the old system, memory is passive. No, it's a trained thing, and you actively construct something. So you don't look for a true memory, but rather you construct what your past could have been or what you want it to be. And in the meeting of what has been, then you get reality. And that past is the fractal true reality of what happened. And therein lies knowledge. Because it's in the past, in the retention, you get knowledge enough to inform the projection. So there's a big difference here. In the old model, it's like an CPU reading off or a RAM reading off memories automatically. I called it before ego. Well, I can stick to the ego. It's an automatic thing. It just do things by themselves, and it reads off the absent events. It's nothing active anymore. They are affected by absentees. And of course we become passive receiver, and anything could happen with the memories. They can put us down, make us depressed, take away the prana. This is what the ontic model does, takes away the energy, makes us stuck with the memories. They become unchangeable and unreal. And as they become unreal, they make a depressing, lowering force. This is this obscurity of non-knowledge. Awareness and key are very similar, not exactly the same thing. But this is a model that takes away that energy, that always can be regained in each moment, but also trained to become an incredible force. And once we learn that new way of doing things, that is much more intentional than a habit. It is not a passive exitive function. I even despise the word. It sounds so mechanical. This is an active function. And no longer your memories will be burdens, something you put on your back and hampering your futuring. Instead, they will automatically inform your futuring, make it stronger, letting knowledge into the projection and making them more complex. So you can see the two different varieties in two different ends. They're not absolute contradictions. There is a gliding scale. But compare the ghost of the past or spectre of Marx or whatever you want. These things in the old model just come to deterministic decide the future. And you feel you have a choice. You can choose between two scenarios. Either go to the pizza shop or don't go to the pizza shop. That's the limit of your possibility for intentional acts. Whereas this most open doesn't start anywhere from, like memories that mold the future, puts limits in what can happen and tells you what can happen or not happen. So you see here, it is neurology, but it's fractality, but it's also these philosophical things that we discussed before, like determinism and the lack of consciousness that we know from science of cognition, and also the Western way of not planning. Because once the past becomes a burden and we want to get rid of it, it is this demon of absenteeism, the thing that is no longer present. We will also cut off the knowledge we need to inform our projections, the complexity. And this could be seen as from a societal pattern also. Sweden is a very good example here, maybe the most extreme, but we've given up our traditions in the idea that they didn't carry anything. But from the viewpoint of metaphysics of presence, they don't. They're just a burden. They're just decorum. It's the maypole of midsummer. It's Santa Claus at Christmas. It is the rhyming for the porridge and so forth. It's just curiosities. Think about it carefully. Where else can we gain knowledge to understand what comes? Can only be in the past, and in an active past. We've seen how the old literature is becoming discarded because the new ways of reading them cannot fractally access the contents. If you read Shakespeare without expectations, without a preconceived idea of what you're going to find there, you will not find anything. Passivity will not help you to understand the world. Passivity in itself is a lack of energy. Sitting in the theater, maybe in Athens or Ephesus, looking at what's happening, this is where we placed ourselves because of unthought limitations. And what Susie Vrobel does, and of course deconstruction, is it lets us investigate. And once we start to investigate, we also learn there are other ways. It is not like the future is just the temporal linear sequence of movements that been in the past getting repeated somehow and showing off the same patterns. In every neurological book until recently I read, the explanation why reality gets more boring when we get older is that we already experience so much, so we interpret it in the old way. And in the neurology books, this is seen as a completely natural thing. I would say it doesn't have to be that way, and it's quite a limiting thing as well. Why would the future look like the past? It's ridiculous in itself. It could be completely different, and time and history has changed many times before. Sweden, for instance, lost its great empire in a matter of months, I would say. Maybe only weeks. That was unexpected. That was not a repetition of what happened before. Not at all. Many things, well, I'll say most things in history are not clear repetitions as we perceive them to be when we read a history book. We always think everything is so predetermined. And this is, we're using these glasses that says that the future somehow mirrors the past. And this is simple reflection. This is a crude, coarse reflection taken for Rodolphe Cachet. That is not the case. Doesn't have to be so. And it helped me to think about the mirror once more when I understood that. They don't have to be mirror image. We can investigate and see if they are mirror images. But don't beforehand assume it. This is not the message from history. In history, many odd things has happened. And many great turns has erupted within months, weeks, even hours. And it doesn't give any predictive force to us projections. Simply not very smart assuming that the future should be like the past. It's too crude. It's not fractal enough. It is not complex enough. It doesn't have enough energy. Because, well, it's not a good choice of words to call key energy. Complexity is a better word. And this is I'm going to get into later. Energy is complexity, but rather to mention energy in this circumstance or this connection, it's better to use complexity as the start. The very complexity level, it's what makes for the force in the prana. This is what creates the future. You are maker of your own destiny, but you need building blocks, and that you find in the past. And you find it in the traditions. Traditions that gives you rewards. And this is also show you why traditions lingered on in the East, for instance. Because they are the ones that makes it possible to be in an objective reality, shared by others. Westerners are closed off, idiosyncratic, loop-like existences. They all create their own reality, their own scarabee or beetle box, having not much collectivity in common, having not much common with the exogenous, but I would say also with the endogenous. It becomes a general personality called the ego, lacking the complexity of a true self. That force that true self has is spiritual to the level even. Greater complexity makes it possible for you to build the soul. Instead of thinking it's a passive gift of nature's self in a Greek way. An active construction of retention and projection can give a truer and more real now. And now I'm talking about a now with a capital letter. It is when you have retention going and pretension going. Then you get this awareness. And this awareness is very different from the automata or the CPU or the ego. This is a reflective awareness. This is elegant by Susie Vrobel. This goes to show the answer for the question, why don't we have reflection anymore? Why has reflection ceased to be a thing of the modern man? He can no longer introspect and see what he thinks, see his wants, emotions, cannot see his memories, and they don't mean anything to him. They become darkened and obscured, diluted. Here we see it is only when you get this full presence of a projection and you use your tradition, your religion, the old things to make a much more complex model, because the complexity is the truth, is the complexity level, not a true origin of the metaphysics of presence. No, here complexity itself tells its message. And I'm almost certain this was the case long before the pre-Socratics. And once we from the traditional religion also get the intention, you see this is part and parcel of the whole thing. You get your rewards in heaven, you get your better destiny from acting more morally. This makes projection being more active and you get more reality. And since we can reverse the whole thing, you can understand that projection comes from reality, because this is what makes reality real. And all of a sudden, traditions, religions, faiths become much more understandable. They are coming from the very interactiveness and climb bottle-like turning into itself, being a part of space itself. Fractality is interpenetrative. Could be completely different, the mental sphere and the material sphere or the space sphere, but it's also some ways also the same. And them being same doesn't exclude complete difference, otherness, endogenous, exogenous. You can have both at the very same time. There is no rule made in reality that says exclusion is a necessity. You can access that knowledge directly. You don't have to look through on it your memories, your past, with the help of the ego. You can access them directly by being different, by being complex, by having wants and wills. And it's actually intention that is lacking today. And realizing that it is almost an illusion being at the theater. You get out of that illusion or illusion-like reality, and you get into the reality of intention. Because in the viewpoint of Edmund Husserl and Henri Bergson, it is intention ultimately that builds reality, so it can be shared. Whereas passivity is a singular occurrence in the Western Hemisphere that we until recently been unaware of, and it caused limitations that we never could have made visible without the advent of quantum mechanics. But now they are visible, and we can change them by understanding them. And changing and understanding is the same thing. Once we let awareness shine on these processes, we understand also that this moving into each other, this nesting of future into the past, and past into the future, makes up the now with a big capital letter, when we are really present in our futuring and in our pasting or retention. Doesn't it make sense somehow? When you are active, your intention, your wants are there, the meaning you get out of the world, which gets fueled by what your religion gives you, your philosophy, your faith give you, your Viking tradition or whatever they are. They show you, and by their very complexity, puts prana into the world and thereby making it real. This fixatedness, I studied more into Ian McKiltry's The Matter with Things. This fixatedness leads to those things that are actually a person who even more believe memories are absolutely passive and futuring is not a verb, it's just future as an object, an ontic thing. And that real horrible disease is schizophrenia, a new thing that came with this development, and it causes physical changes within the person, because the physical is constantly interpenetrative. And if you start looking for objects anywhere, you will send a direction to your whole system of looking for object becoming more and more passive in your construction, and all of a sudden you get fixed with the outsideness, and your living spiritual being becomes slow, like a sloth. It's no longer active. This is the spiritual way or level of the analytical philosopher, like Searle, just looking at the world and imposing limits on it. I would add some juice to tomorrow's lecture with John Searle's Limited Incorporated. I'll be looking into it. But it's a fairly modern take on this myth of the sloth-like nature of the observer who's not in on it. Inte med på noterna, as we say in Swedish, which I think is actually incredibly fitting. Not in on the tunes, hard to translate saying in Swedish. But since time is a tune, you need to adjust your ears to that tune. And you need to project the end of the tune already at the start. You need to see the end of your own history when you start doing projection. That has to be absolutely active. and where it's the difference between your expected feel of the music and what actually comes to your ear, or the exogenous. This is what reality constructs. That's the difference. So you see here, my projection has double positive bonus. When they are, so to speak, positive for my sake, they are good, but also in the way they differ from the exogenous. Therefrom comes the energy. If they were completely alike, which is the illusion of metaphysics of presence, the classical worldview, they will not give off any energy at all. It would be a copying. It would be, as Edward de Bono, the stop of the same, because same stops off everything. That is the moment you become a sloth. This is the moment when you stop to think, when you no longer are participating in the active procedure of futuring, and you put your own goals into that, which is incredibly important. You cannot reach the exogenous without your using your whole force, your whole wants, needs, search. And in this process you will also be able to progress, because what else could take you past all slopes? If you don't have a projective trajectory that leads you up, you are bound to go down into the slopes, and for every downward pull you go further and further down. An active projection is the only thing that can take you past and lead you to a reality, because down here there is no longer energy to make reality real. Doesn't give any colors, because you don't actively send anything out from your eyes, which is incredibly important. And then you don't get any colors, and you don't get any differences, shapes, forms. And if you don't send anything from your ears, you don't get the sound of the bees, the birds back. It doesn't get in there. It's not just they are blocked. You need to do it yourself. The world is not sitting in the sofa and hoping somebody's going to serve you drink. You're not at a restaurant. You are an active participant, and you have always been. But somewhere this sloth-like nature becomes something that we inherited. But no longer is the case that we unconsciously need to accept it. We can let knowledge get into the picture, and we can let knowledge inform reality. And knowledge is in itself this thrust forward, this directionality, this beautiful, beautiful direction that makes your body active and whole, makes you balance on Mother Earth, and also lets you go into the surrounding areas of the world and going into space. And instead of the old idea that you get diminished by taking in otherness, maybe this is at the very core of the metaphysics of presence, that there is a scare for the exogenous. The scare is from the ego to get lost in the world. And maybe that's why we in the West construct these simulacra, made up realities inside ourselves, because we want the ego to survive, or it itself wants to survive somehow in this own made, not true making of our own mind, this randomness, and the inability to project the future, predict the future, and inform the future. For every time you lose your predictions, you don't gain what you want, which is very important, that you gain your goals. Goal-oriented fractality is what makes us live. But every time you are stranded in this without a projection, every time you lose your predicting power, you will do it even less next time. and this is the downward vortex. To get out of that, we need a push. Susie Vrobel, I would say, it's quite a definite push. It's a freshness to what she writes, and she also gathers so much information. For instance, on this Otto E. Rössler, spelled in the Swedish way, R-Ö-S-S-L-E-R, Rössler, who writes about how we are, so to speak, we are the membrane between the outside and the inside. This is where we live. And when I read that, I started thinking about this membrane or dividing line between dorsal and ventral. And we need to focus on that to make those distinctions clear. And then these distinctions will work to our benefit, to make us stronger, and we get this movement. And I start thinking about this ray, a sort of a fish of, I think the shark species, not a proper fish. It doesn't have bones, it has cartilage instead. But a ray flies, it has a very sure direction. So we can learn from the animals to get the direction back again. And it's a constant turning of dorsal ventral that makes the movement. And the same movement is the movement between exogenous, the outward thing, and the endogenous. And when they work together, it's almost like a ray moving forward. And all of a sudden, instead of standing unbalanced, which I've done until now in this lecture, you gain balance again. You gain this equilibrium, an equilibrium that is also movement. It's not a static equilibrium. It makes it possible for me to move that way or that way. I don't have to be stuck in this position. So the body also takes a passivity. That passivity is, of course, the shutting off of the senses, not sending anything out and just waiting for the world to come to you, sort of for handen or something similar. So this is my first summary, I would say, of the first 5 chapters in the book Fractal Time by Susie Vrobel, but also an invitation to check out Otto E. Rössler, and there's another chap called I.R. Powers. I check him up myself and return to him later on. Why? Very positive. I say thank you very much, and I wish you a very pleasant afternoon. Bye bye for now.